And first of all, it's a pleasure to have you here. And we really thank you for accepting to be part in our session. Actually, this session is a partnership with the School of Public Health from University of São Paulo, and they will join us too. So thank you very much, Paul. And we are already recording and in Zoom. However, we're going to be live on YouTube in the next second. Josi, podemos começar?
Já estamos ao vivo no YouTube.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here today with another Hcor scientific meeting in partnership with the School of Public Health of University of São Paulo and INSPE. And I am Israel Maia. I am a researcher at Hcor Institute, and I will be your host today. Before we start, I would like to give you some housekeeping announcements. And this lecture is going to be recorded. A certificate of attendance is issued by the School of Public Health of University of São Paulo. And the link to obtain it will be posted on the chat box, both on Zoom and YouTube. There will be time for questions and answers in the end. During the Q&A session, if you don't want to speak, please just write down on the chat box your question. And finally, please keep your mic on mute throughout the presentation. Por favor, deixe o seu microfone mutado durante a apresentação. It's a pleasure to present Professor Paul Young. Professor Paul Young is an intensive care specialist from Wellington in New Zealand, and member of the Australian New Zealand Intensive Care Society Clinical Trials Group. His expertise in the design and conduct of large-scale multi-center randomized controlled trials in the field of intensive care medicine and in clinical trials science methodology is internationally recognized. In the past 10 years, he has established himself as a highly recognized figure in the field of clinical ICU research. He has published 13 manuscripts in New England Journal of Medicine, 7 in JAMA, and 1 in Lancet. In 2020, the manuscript for ICU ROCKS trial, on which Professor Young was the chief investigator, was selected by the editors of the New England Journal of Medicine as one of the top 14 most notable New England Journal papers of the year. His main project currently is the Mega ROCKS trial, which we in Hcor participate as a Brazilian coordinating center, and is a 40,000 participant international registered embedded ICU oxygen trial. And the lecture that Professor Young will give to us is a registry embedded clinical trials. And this talk will cover the following material. Why do we need novel approaches to clinical trials? What are registry embedded trials and how are they helpful? Examples of registry embedded trials that I have conducted, and what are the problems with the registry embedded trials? So Paul, thank you very much, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. My name's Paul, and it's a real pleasure and an honour to be here. I would have to say that a Brazilian academic audience is kind of a very intimidating audience to me. One of the things I've noticed in my international collaborations is that people who are academically trained and have a clinical interest from Brazil have very rigorous and high standards in terms of their training and their knowledge. And I'm sure that a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today will be familiar. I guess what I'm going to try to do is start off by outlining some principles that I think sort of are the key reason why we need to conduct big trials, and then go on to explain some ways in which registry trials can be useful. So apart from the fact that these are trials that I do and that I have an interest in, I have no conflicts of interest to declare. So as you've heard, my main interest is in the conduct and design of large-scale randomized controlled trials, and I'm primarily interested in things where there's idiosyncratic practice variation. Put simply, I'm really interested in things where one doctor does one thing and another doctor does another thing, but neither of them really know what to do is right, or they both believe that they know the thing that's right, even though the things that they believe are right are opposite to each other. And my strong belief is that when we encounter situations like those, we should feel an obligation to randomize our treatments so that we can learn. Every time we encounter a situation like this, I think we should be thinking about how we can systematically evaluate it so that in 5 or 10 years from now, all the patients get the best treatment rather than the treatment the doctor believes in. And there are a number of obstacles to overcome to do this kind of research. But to understand them, I think it's quite useful to think about something that doesn't have anything to do with research at all. So, as you can see on the screen, there's a picture of a person there. And the question says, what are the chances that this person worships the devil? And an alternative question that you might ask is, what are the chances that this person's a Christian? And the thing I think that people tend to forget when they look at the pictures is that there are 3 billion Christians in the world, but only 10,000 Satan worshippers. And so looking at the picture to try and get the right answer exposes you to a common cognitive bias that affects human beings. And that's a bias that we tend to put too much weight on the specific and insufficient weight on the general. So this particular bias is known as base rate neglect. So here's another way of thinking about the problem. So think of a hypothetical breath test to detect drunk drivers. Now, imagine that this test detects 100% of drunk drivers and has a 5% false positive rate. And then ask yourself, if the driver has a positive test, what are the chances that they're drunk? So this is the wrong answer, but it's an answer that pops into people's heads a lot of the time if they haven't thought about the problem. Let's, for the sake of the argument, say that 1 out of every 1,000 drivers is drunk. Well, out of those 1,000 drivers, there can only be 1 true positive because no one else is drunk. But from the 999 non-drunk drivers with a 5% false positive rate, you expect around 49 false positives. In other words, with a positive test, only 1 out of 50 or 2% of the patients, of the people who have a positive test are actually drunk. And so to understand the results of randomized controlled trials, you need to think of randomized controlled trials as diagnostic tests of a trial hypothesis. And I understand that it's probably not entirely clear from what I've said so far what this has to do with randomized controlled trials, or indeed with registry embedded trials, but it turns out that it has a lot to do with it, because there's a systematic bias that affects the design and conduct of clinical trials, which is profoundly important. In this study that you can see up on the screen, we looked at registered clinical trials in the field of intensive care medicine that were recruiting patients, and we asked clinicians how likely they thought that the hypothesis being investigated was true. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we found that generally people rated the probability of a hypothesis being true as low. Now, the systematic bias that affects trials is delta inflation. The effect sizes that are used in sample size calculations are typically larger than most clinicians believe are possible. So let's think about what this means in terms of what we have just been talking about. So up on the screen, you can see 100 boxes. Now, these 100 boxes represent 100 ICU trials. Let's, for the sake of argument, say that 10% of the trials are true. Well, if 10% of the trials are true, they are the trials that are contained by this green box. Now, if we apply a frequentist framework and we have 90% power, then the red boxes are the times when we will obtain a statistically significant result that is true. Unfortunately, we will also expect the p-value to be less than 0.05 for all of the dark blue boxes as well, because a p-value of less than 0.05 means under the assumption that the null hypothesis is correct, you will get a p-value of less than 0.055% of the time. And so what you can see on the screen here is that this equates to about a 67% chance of a trial that's positive actually representing a true positive. Now, unfortunately, 10% of trial hypotheses being true in intensive care medicine trials is a wildly optimistic scenario. And the problem is that if only 1% of the hypotheses are correct, then it becomes 5 times more likely that a trial result will be false than true. So all of this has really been designed to make just one point, and that's the point that for the kinds of things I'm interested in, common therapies that are subject to practice variation, realistic treatment effect sizes are small. And if we conduct underpowered trials, we will create confusion. We will end up with one trial that says one thing and another trial that says another thing, and clinicians will become disillusioned with randomized controlled trials, and instead of resolving uncertainty, we will perpetuate it. And so when people get disillusioned with randomized controlled trials, here's what happens. So the first thing that happens is they try to argue that the solution is to conduct observational studies using big data. Now, the problem with this approach is that such studies are subject to bias. When realistic treatment effect sizes are small, it's simply not plausible or possible to draw causal inferences from observational data. This is a slide showing the robust correlation between the age of Miss America and the number of murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. So the singular beauty of a randomized controlled trial is it allows you to draw causal inferences about therapies, and observational data just don't allow you to do that. So the second thing that people will say, and this is probably the most common thing, is they'll say, randomized trials don't help us. What we need to do is individualize therapy. Now, people like this because they find it empowering. They can look at the patient, they can assess the physiology, and they can decide what to do. So here are the problems with this approach. So in the FEAST trial, they evaluated fluid bolus therapy. Fluid bolus therapy made the physiology better. It made the children who were treated look better, and it made them more likely to die. Here's another trial that illustrates the point, the Hcor trial. The brain, as you appreciate, is encased in a solid box. After a traumatic brain injury, the brain swells. Because the brain is encased in a solid box, the swelling of the brain increases the pressure. This increase in pressure impairs blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain and results in secondary brain injury. Much of the treatment that's provided to patients after a traumatic brain injury is designed to control intracranial pressure, and the ultimate way to control intracranial pressure is to remove the skull. This is a decompressive craniectomy. The Hcor trial evaluated decompressive craniectomy in patients with severe traumatic brain injury. And what you can see on the slide is that decompressive craniectomy dramatically, immediately, and obviously reduced the intracranial pressure. It reduced the amount of time patients spent on life support. It also reduced the amount of time that they spent in intensive care, but it made no difference to survival, and it resulted in more patients surviving with severe brain damage. Just like FEAST, it was a powerful example of the dangers of physiological surrogates and dogma. So, here's the problem with individualizing treatments based on physiological variables. Things that make patients look better can also make them more likely to die. And when we make decisions about which treatments work based on clinical experience, we are subject to availability bias. That is, we can only judge the effectiveness of the treatments based on the information that's available to us. The physiological responses to therapies are immediate, and yet the effect on patient-important outcomes like mortality and recovery are remote. Here's the second problem. Because there is no clear basis to individualize care, the consequence of the individualizing care approach is that each doctor does whatever they want. The treatment that's given to an individual patient depends on the doctor's belief and the doctor's internal narrative, and not the patient's situation. Accordingly, this is a pathway to doctor-centered care. The only way to rationally individualize treatment seems to me to conduct randomized controlled trials that are large enough to allow you to identify heterogeneity of treatment effect. To conduct trials where even the subgroups give you sufficient power to detect differences that are plausible. Now, this thinking that I've provided you in the sort of background to the talk so far is what underpins the MEGAROX trial. So this is a trial that compares conservative oxygen and liberal oxygen in patients who require unplanned life support in the intensive care unit. The MEGAROX trial has 40,000 participants, and it's really a series of very large randomized controlled trials in important subgroups where different responses to oxygen therapy might be expected. And conducting a 40,000 patient trial like this poses many logistic challenges. It's required us to collaborate internationally on a scale that's never been attempted before, but it's also required us to have innovative solutions to minimize the burden associated with collecting study data. One way of minimizing the burden of data collection is to conduct registry-embedded clinical trials. And there are numerous examples of such trials, that many of which I'm sure you'll be aware of. And a registry is an organized system where one collects uniform data to evaluate specified outcomes for a population defined by a particular disease or condition, and that serves one or more predetermined scientific, clinical, or policy purposes. The reality is that as a clinical trialist, I don't really care about whether the data is in a registry or not. Any data that are already collected and stored electronically are data that we can use. And ideally, if you're conducting a clinical trial and the data you're interested in are already collected, you don't want to have to collect them again. Because if you can use the data that are already available, things cost much less and processes are much more efficient. So I guess that's the first key point that I would like to make, is I don't think that you should feel when designing a registry embedded trial that you need to be actually confined to the registry, or that you need to be wedded to only one source of data. So here are some problems that people encounter when they come to trying to do a registry embedded trial. Well, the first problem is our registry does not have all the data that we need. So a related problem is every centre does not contribute to the registry. So the approach that I have taken to deal with these problems is to create trials where we use registry data when possible, but maintain the flexibility to use data collect data by other means. So in the MEGAROX trial, some data points are obtained from ICU registries in some sites. These include the ICU admission source, the type of admission, the illness severity, the ICU length of stay, and the hospital length of stay. Okay. But some of the data points in the MEGAROX trial, including the ones that you can see on the screen relating to oxygenation, are not in a registry. And so we collect those data points from all patients directly from the clinical notes. So here's another problem, and this is one that I encountered quite early on in the process of doing registry trials, is that it can be difficult to obtain the unique identifier that identifies a patient in the registry and to include it in your study database. One of the issues that arises here is that often clinical trial data are collected at the time that the patient's in the intensive care unit, but the patient's data for registry purposes might not be collected for some time later, until some time later. And so the identifier that identifies the patient in the registry might not be available at the time the research coordinators are collecting the study data. So in the MEGAROX trial, we have used the approach of matching patients to the registries using common data elements. So what we do is, based on the site of the patient, the age of the patient, the gender of the patient, the date of ICU admission, the date of hospital admission, and the date of ICU discharge, all of which are collected in the study database, we identify the patient in the registry. So this actually means that the problem of needing to obtain a linkage key or a registry data point to identify each individual in the registry to obtain the data that you need later is eliminated. This is also useful when you need to collect data from multiple different sources because, you know, age, gender, and so on, these variables can be common to many data sources. So here's another problem. So the registry might have errors. Well, there are different ways to approach this, and I think it depends to a large extent on how critical the data point is. So one option is just not to worry. So any errors that appear in the registry data are likely to be random, and to the extent that they're not random, they're likely to affect both treatment groups equally. So they shouldn't be a source of bias. On the other hand, you can be selective, right? So if you really think that a data point is very important and that the risk of error in the registry is not worth the logistic benefit gained from collecting data from the registry, then you can just collect that data point in the study database. So in the MEGAROX trial, we started off by obtaining hospital discharge data on in-hospital mortality from the registry. Counted when we did that was that there were some errors. So there were some patients who were marked as dead who weren't dead, and some patients who were marked as alive who were not alive. And so at the very first interim analysis that we conducted in the MEGAROX trial, we identified that there was some difficulties with matching all of the patients and that there were some errors. And we decided that for the primary outcome variable, which is in hospital mortality, that those errors just were not acceptable. And so we then went back, and for all the patients we'd enrolled already, we obtained the in-hospital mortality data directly from the clinical records. And that's what we've done for the remaining patients that we have enrolled since. Okay. So, as I sort of alluded to already, another problem is that you can't find all the study patients in the registry. So there are a few reasons that this can happen. One reason is that the patient's just not in the registry, so the data just haven't been entered. Another reason is that there's an error in one or more of the data points that are used for matching. And you can expect some difficulty in matching all of the patients. And that means that you can expect with a registry embedded trial that some degree of validation of the data points will be required. Effectively, your solutions are to either accept some missingness, which may be acceptable if the degree of missingness is low, and or you can collect the data directly from the medical records when you need to. So if you can't find the patient in the registry, you can just go back to the site and ask for the data that you need for that particular patient. And this is still much, much less work than collecting all of the data from every patient. So inability to match patients is a little bit annoying, but it's not the end of the world, and it doesn't really pose a major problem. So much of what I've learned about registry embedded trials, I learned by conducting the PEPTIC trial. And so for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to kind of quickly go through that trial and explain what we found and what we did, because it gives you an idea of what you can do with a registry embedded trial at a kind of extreme end. So the PEPTIC trial is a trial of proton pump inhibitors versus histamine receptor blockers for ulcer prophylaxis in the intensive care unit. And it's a trial about giving stress ulcer prophylaxis to people who require mechanical ventilation in ICU. And this trial had 26,982 patients, which makes it the largest critical care trial ever undertaken, had a budget of under $500,000 US. It's conducted in 50 intensive care units in 5 countries. And I guess before I tell you about the methodology, I'll just give you a little bit of background about the clinical problem. So stress ulcer prophylaxis is very commonly prescribed in contemporary intensive care practice. And in fact, the vast majority of mechanically ventilated patients in intensive care units receive it. The most commonly administered medicines are proton pump inhibitors, but a sizable number of people receive histamine receptor blockers. And indeed, in some intensive care units, histamine receptor blockers are used most commonly. And this variation has much more to do with doctors and hospitals than it does to do with patients. People choose proton pump inhibitors because they appear to be effective at reducing gastrointestinal bleeding in intensive care patients. And in the SUP-ICU trial, the relative risk of bleeding for people who had a PPI as opposed to placebo was 0.58. So they reduced the risk of bleeding pretty dramatically. One potential reason to choose histamine receptor blockers instead of proton pump inhibitors is that the profound acid suppression from PPIs might result in bacterial overgrowth in the stomach, and then critically ill patients might then reflux bacteria and get pneumonia. So the treatment effect estimate for pneumonia in the SUP-ICU trial was pretty wide. The confidence intervals encompassed the possibility of a 16% relative decrease and a 16% relative increase. Another interesting piece of information is that proton pump inhibitors do have immunosuppressive effects, so they inhibit natural killer cell activity, They reduce neutrophil chemotaxis and superoxide generation. And although the clinical significance of these effects is not known, it's possible for critically ill patients they might matter. And a final concern is that that proton pump inhibitors might increase your risk of getting clostridial infection. So the comparative effect of these drugs on mortality is not known, or wasn't known before we did the peptic trial, because adequately trialed randomized controlled trials had not been conducted, even though the medicines had been given to patients for many decades. So the peptic trial is a multi-center cluster randomized crossover registry trial comparing the safety and efficacy of proton pump inhibitors and histamine 2 receptor blockers. And the crucial point about this trial design in relation to the topic of discussion today is that rather than finding patients in the registry who were in the study, we used the registry itself to define the study population. Every patient who was ventilated in a participating site in the registry was in the study. So with a cluster crossover trial, we randomized intensive cares rather than randomizing patients. And what we were looking at was the default ulcer prophylaxis strategy applied at the level of the intensive care unit. Accordingly, every patient who was in the intensive care unit at the time the strategy was applied was eligible, and therefore using the registry, which captured all of the patients who were in the intensive care unit as the primary data source for the trial, meant that the trial could be conducted extremely easily and efficiently. No individual patient randomization was needed. And for the bulk of the data, no data collection was needed. So, like I mentioned before, though, because everything of interest is not in the registry, we needed to collect some data from trial-specific data sources. So all the patients who were admitted to the intensive care unit with an upper GI bleed were excluded, but every other patient in the ICU was included in the trial if they were in the registry. So this is a flow diagram just to show you what occurred. This is what we ended up with, around 13,500 patients in each group to evaluate. It's pretty typical looking intensive care population. So age 58 years, 2/3 were male, 50% medical, 50% surgical. As I mentioned, it's default proton pump inhibitor or default histamine receptor blocker, and it's open label treatment. The clinicians got to decide for individual patients what treatment was used, but the default was the one assigned to the intensive care unit. Patients who were already taking a proton pump inhibitor prior, they switched to the study treatment allocated to the intensive care unit. Patients who remained in the intensive care unit through a crossover continued with the original treatment they were prescribed. There wasn't any washout between crossovers. The treatment duration was until ICU discharge. The clinician could always override the default, and a proton pump inhibitor was given if GI bleeding occurred. So we didn't actually collect on every patient whether they received a proton pump inhibitor or a histamine receptor blocker, but we conducted various different evaluations of what drugs were given to patients. And what you can see here is that for the patients admitted when an ICU was allocated to proton pump inhibitors, the vast majority received a proton pump inhibitor, whereas those admitted when a histamine receptor blocker was given, the vast majority received a histamine receptor blocker. The primary outcome was in-hospital mortality up to 90 days. And because the sample was very big, the treatment estimates were very narrow. 18.3% of the proton pump inhibitor group died, and 17.5% of the histamine receptor blocker group died. And that corresponds to a relative risk of death of 1.05. And the 95% confidence intervals just reached unity. The 99% confidence intervals, they're not actually too much wider. And the 99.9% confidence intervals, they're a bit wider, but it's still much, much more likely that proton pump inhibitors increase mortality, and really you can pretty much exclude the possibility of them decreasing mortality. There's the same thing shown as an absolute difference. And, you know, I guess this is potentially an important finding on a global public health scale, because the size of the mortality effect that appears to be attributable to the choice of stress ulcer prophylaxis for 2.5 million ventilated people a year would correspond to 23,250 lives. This is the survival curves. Now, we obviously measured as well what happened to GI bleeding, and here, this is not in a registry at all. So we had to collect overt GI bleeding episodes from study participants, but these are quite memorable events, right? So rather than screening every patient every day to see if one of these events had occurred, we could just chat with whoever was on looking after the patients in the intensive care unit every day and say, hey, has anyone had a big GI bleed? And that's what we did. And if they had, we identified the patients so that we could match them in the registry. We found that the risk of GI bleeding was lower for patients allocated to proton pump inhibitors. You can see here that the 95% confidence intervals don't encompass unity. So that's a clinically significant and statistically significant reduction, I think. There was no difference in the risk of clostridial infection. The ICU length of stay was pretty similar, or duration of mechanical ventilation pretty similar, hospital length of stay pretty similar. And we didn't actually collect pneumonia, but in the Canadian sites that participated, we used this thing called ventilator-associated conditions, which is collected in their registry. And the number of ventilator-associated conditions we observed was slightly higher in the patients allocated to proton pump inhibitors. That's the risk ratio that you can see there. And that's the end of my talk, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you have.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for this amazing lecture. And I'm sure the audience have many questions. Please, everyone, if you do have any questions, raise your hand or just write it down on the chat box, please. Well, I will start first with a question, Paul. I was reading a systematic review from 2020 about registered embedded clinical trials, and what we see in that systematic review, we see that they found 17 studies by that time from 8 registered around the world, especially US and the Scandinavian countries. And if you think about how important these type of RCTs are, and we find not many of them already published. And could you comment a little bit? What's what you think is the most important difficulty about doing this type of study around the world, and especially if we think so few countries have a really important registry that we can rely on. And
yeah, so I mean, I think there's some really interesting points, right? So the Scandinavians have very much led this area, so I think that in Sweden they have a really excellent heart registry that includes a lot of data that are what you want to collect if you conduct a large-scale cardiology trial. I think that the major challenge that people encounter in conducting registry trials is that most registries are not designed with clinical trials in mind. So they don't have the data points in them that you really want. And I think, I don't know if the systematic review that you described included the peptic trial in it. Maybe it must have been close to that time, but many people, I think, would not consider the peptic trial to be a true registry embedded trial, because although it was registry embedded, we collected a lot of data from patients individually. And I think that the approach that I sort of advocate for is to try and think of creative ways that you can use existing sources of data, no matter what they are, in order to minimize the data burden, to make the cost of conducting the trials less, and to allow you to scale up and do larger scale things for the amount of money that it might usually take you to do something smaller.
well, great. Thank you, Paul. Bruno, do you have a question?
Israel, only to tell you that also there are questions in the chat.
Oh, I can see it. Well, I will allow Bruno to make the question, and then I will just finish the chat.
It's just a quick question. So, Paul, your registry in New Zealand, how old is it? Because we have sense that a registry, once you start it, it takes some time to maturate for all the centers to get used to filling the data. How was the register created? Was all ICUs at once? Was stepwise? For how long you guys already have it? Because it seems that now it runs smoothly in New Zealand. So you have reliable data, although you might have some things to improve. But compared to what we're trying to do here in Brazil, you guys are way ahead of us. And just to have a glimpse on how long do you think you would take for things like that?
So this year is the 30th year of the Australian and New Zealand Intensive Care Society registry. And, it is very much a registry that was established for reasons of quality improvement. And it's now mandatory for every intensive care unit in Australia and New Zealand to contribute to the registry, because the primary purpose of the registry is to produce standardized mortality rates for sites, to identify outliers at a sort of national and binational level. So 30 years is obviously well more than my time. And so, I guess over the last, decade and a bit that I've been involved, the registry has always worked pretty well, and the data, it's quite uncommon for a patient to not be in the database because there's a lot of checks and balances in place to make sure that they are, and the registry does incorporate a number of internal consistency checks, and when each site submits their data, centrally there's a data quality process, and it's quite common for your initial submission to be rejected because you have errors in it. So there are various validation checks of various fields, but I would have to say, unfortunately, I don't have the knowledge of how that came about or how it evolved over the time. But you're right that our registry is quite well established. I mean, I guess the sort of flip side of it is, like, it does depend on what you want the data that you want to get out of the database, and what the consequences are of having errors in those data, provided that the errors are not a source of bias. So I'll give you an example, right? So it seems very unlikely that any errors in the age or the gender or the admission source of the patients, whatever those errors would be consequential and or would threaten the internal validity of your trial. On the other hand, if the errors are in whether the patient's dead or not, and your primary outcome is in-hospital mortality, clearly that's a problem. But even for our registry, which is established and has been there for a long time, they were still problems. Yeah.
Well, I will ask you the question from the chat, and it comes from Alain Nogueira, and he says, thanks for the excellent discussion, Professor Young. And do you think that a registry-based trial would differ from a target trial emulation in terms of the risk of random and systematic errors?
Yeah, I mean, this is not a thing that I have a great deal of expertise in, and I reckon that there's bound to be other people listening to this talk who can give a much better answer than I can to that question. So I might just say I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I guess the sort of target trial emulation approach is still, it's still not randomized, and the risk is that you might not be able to draw causal inferences from it, whereas you should be able to draw causal inferences from registry embedded randomized trials, but I am not an expert.
Okay, thank you. And I call Leticia to give you a question, please.
So thank you, Paul. Can you listen to me well? Because I am in the street. I'm sorry for that, but I couldn't miss your talk. So thank you for your talk. And my question goes in the direction of data management workload. So you have experience with traditional randomized control trials, and now you gave to us this lecture on registry embedded trials. Are they comparable? Is it much less? Is it much more, maybe? I would like to hear from you on data management workload. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess the two trials that I've described in detail, the Megarox trial and the Peptic trial, are quite different in terms of the workload for data on the data management side. So the Peptic trial was extraordinarily easy to do in terms of the amount of work for research coordinators and people at sites on the data management side is almost no work. The reason we could do that trial with the amount of money that we had is that the registry, exists, and it has its entire infrastructure behind it, collecting the information already. And the additional workload that was required to be doing the peptic trial on top of it literally just was, once a day, the research coordinators asking if anyone in the intensive care unit had a massive GI bleed or not. There was really nothing else to do in that trial. Now, the MEGAROX trial is a bit closer to a conventional trial in terms of the workload, although we've got a pretty small number of data points that need to be collected. But I think even then, the illness severity data for the MEGAROX trial come from the registry, and collecting data on illness severity is very time consuming. So the actual data collection stuff for the MEGAROX trial is it's not too bad, but it's closer to what you would normally have. Now, with respect to data management, I think that very much depends on the specifics of the intervention and the level that you're talking about, right? So in the MEGAROX trial, the workload for the sites is quite small, but the workload that's taken on centrally in the Medical Research Institute of New Zealand to keep on top of the data and make sure that people are following the protocol and feeding back to sites when it looks like the oxygen data suggests they are not following the protocol. There's a lot of work that's occurring on the data management side there. And I guess preparing information to conduct the interim analyses, which involves combining various data sources from various different countries together into a single database, that's a pretty heavy burden as well. But overall, I think there's no question that registry embedded trials involve less work in terms of data management and data oversight, than a conventional trial.
Great to hear that. Alexandre, please.
So first, thanks again for the great lecture. And my question is related, it's a very practical one. We have an ICU registry here in Brazil. It's called EpiMed. And many ICUs adhere to it, but of course not all ICUs. And different from Australia and New Zealand, it's a private company maintained service. The similarity is that it's also aimed at providing ICUs data, quality data, SMR and other. So, but again, this is each ICU has to pay to use the registry. So some have, some do not. I would like to ask you, how is it in the ANZICS registry? I understand that the ANZICS maintains the database, and second, who funds the back office and the work to maintain the registry? The ICUs, the government, or the society?
Yeah, the government does, basically. So the New Zealand Ministry of Health and then the state health funding agencies in Australia fund it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Well, we have already 1 hour of lecture, and we don't want to take in more minutes from your pressure time, Paul, but we really appreciated you being here with us and having time to speak to us. And I want to thank you very much. And we are very proud to participate with you in the MEGAROX trial, and that we hope to collaborate with a great amount of patients, and expecting to come more sites on board soon. Well,
yeah, I'm really, really very excited to have Brazil on board. It's brilliant. So good.
Great.
Thank you very much for all the work
again.
you've done to make it happen.
Okay. Well, have a good day then. And everybody, thanks for being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.